Okay, so great. So recording is in progress. You are all here. Thank you so much. We're having a wonderful night here in Tokyo. It's 11 p.m. It's great to have so many participants from different continents. I hope you enjoy it as much as I will. I apologize. I need to just confirm that I'm okay with being recorded. There we go. All right. So this talk is called Below Bid Pricing and Collusion in Multi-Unit Auctions, and due to the time constraint, it's in fact a part of a larger paper that is called Epic Fail, or How Below Bid Pricing Backfires in Multi-Unit Auctions. And it's joint work with Alex Telboim from Oxford and with Sanna Laksa, who's based in the Faroe Islands, and I'm based in Tokyo at ICU. So let's start and talk about below bid pricing. So what we'll focus on today is multi-unit auctions. So we have multi-unit demands for a homogeneous good. So we are in our standard price quantity space. And as typical, we assume that the supply is pre-announced and fixed, and we have aggregated all the individual bids into something that represents a market demand function. So in this context, we find the market clearing price as usual, where supply equals demand. And then we need to figure out how do we price all of these winning bids. And our reference point is what we call the pay as bid rule, pay as bid auction, or sometimes called the discriminatory auction, where every bid is paid in full at the quoted price. And any auction which charges a price lower than this, we will call those auctions with below bid pricing. And a particularly popular example of this is the uniform price auction, which just charges the market clearing price on every unit. Right? And uniform price auctions can be great. And here's a quote from Ausubel et al., on whose formal model we base our work and we extend. And their argument in favor of uniform pricing is as follows. They say that uniform pricing has several desirable properties, including it is easily understood in both static and dynamic forms. It is fair in the sense that the same price is paid by everyone. Thirdly, absent market power, it is efficient and strategically simple in the sense that you just bid what you think it's worth, so it's almost strategy proof. And the exercise of market power under uniform pricing favors smaller bidders. And in the context of their model, where they have linear marginal values, they can also prove that there's an ex post equilibrium in linear strategies, which is ex post incentive compatible, or EPIC. However, there are also some downsides to uniform pricing, and there's a literature on low revenue equilibria in uniform price auctions. Numerous papers start from Wilson in '79, and there's also a literature on collusion and predation, both of uniform price and ascending auctions. So these are all auctions with below bid pricing. What our contribution is to build a formal model that shows how this idea of below bid pricing feeds through to these kinds of complications. So what do we find? In our paper, we cover three cases. The first case looks at bidder asymmetry and value advantage. The second case looks at bidding rings and sequential ascending auctions. But what we focus on today, and what is the main contribution of the paper, is case 3, which looks at collusion in uniform price and other auctions with below bid pricing. What all of these three cases have in common is that a simpler pay as bid design would likely have performed better. Okay, so what follows from what we find? We find that below bid pricing drastically exacerbates consequences of bidder asymmetry and collusion opportunities. And in particular, this intuition that is frequently used in favor of below bid pricing and uniform pricing, which suggests that decoupling prices from bids gives more truthful or strategy-proof behavior, it fails if we have concerns of asymmetry or potential collusion. What we also illustrate is that these nominally sophisticated collusive and predatory strategies were in fact identified by bidders who have no prior auction experience in auctions for very high stakes. Okay, so let's look in a bit more detail at multi-unit auctions. So I've just redrawn the first diagram for the case of two bidders. So now the whole market supply is on our horizontal axis. We've got two bidders, bidder D and E. So D's demand is measured in this direction and bidder E's demand is measured in the other direction. So in fact, E's bid is sort of a residual supply curve for bidder D, right? So the market clearing price happens when the two intersect, and in a uniform price auction, the bidder D would just pay this little rectangle, whereas in a pay as bid auction, they would have to additionally pay this area A. Okay, so we will look at collusion in this setting today, and we call this phenomenon crank handle collusion, which hopefully you will understand why we call it that in one slide's time. So let's suppose that these two bidders are trying to rig the market and collude such that it gets split at this efficient level, but at reserve price, so that they only have to pay the reserve price. Well, let's try this, okay? So bidder D submits a crank handle bid, which is very, very high, then drops off just before the split and then is flat at the reserve, and bidder E submits a mirror image of that, right? In fact, the only place where these two curves intersect is down here at reserve price, so the pre-deviation market clearing price is at reserve and collusion has been achieved. And the reason we call this crank handle collusion is because we just think that's what it looks like. We are not the first to observe this shape, and sometimes this has been called hockey stick bidding, but in our view, the visual analogy here is more accurate. So if you agree with us, please use our terminology in all of your future papers. Okay, so we've got collusion. The next question is it stable, right? And what turns out to be the case is that crank handles are self-enforcing in uniform price auctions. And here is why. Firstly, is it profitable to deviate to a lower price? Well, that's not relevant, right? Because in the collusive scenario, both bidders are already paying the reserve price. So the only other potential feasible deviation for bidder D here is to win more units. But to win more units, they need to crowd out some of these expensive marginal units of bidder E, and that pushes up the post-deviation market clearing price and makes it very loss-making for both of the players. So in fact, in a uniform price auction, even in a one-shot game, crank handle collusion is sustainable. Okay, let's look at the other extreme of pay-as-bid pricing. It's harder to collude here for multiple reasons. Firstly, the crank handle always has to be below the marginal value, right? Because if it were above, those bids would be loss-making. Secondly, even if the market clearing price happens here at reserve, both bidders still have to pay this entire area under their crank handle, and we call this the collusion enforcement premium, right? And this is what they have to pay even if the marginal price is at reserve. So now let's look for collusion, let's now look at deviation incentives, right? And there's first an incentive to deviate to a much lower crank handle. So just maybe an epsilon above reserve, right? Because in that case, the bidder doesn't have to pay the collusion enforcement premium. But also, because the crank handle is everywhere below the marginal value curve, there is a second incentive to deviate to a larger quantity, because even though the price isn't at reserve, it's below marginal value, so this deviation is also potentially profitable. So what our model will do is it will evaluate the incentive for these two kinds of deviations and correlate that with the degree of below bid pricing. But you can already see that there are now two incentives for deviation in a pay-as-bid auction, and a uniform price auction there were none. Okay, so very quickly to give you a summary of the model and our results. What we do is we build a dynamic model of collusion in multi-unit auctions, and the stage game is what I've just shown you before. So we have a number of players who are trying to collude using crank handles. We assume that they have linear marginal values like Ausubel et al. And what we do, as is typical in a sort of repeated game folk theorem setting, we look for the lowest collusion sustaining discount factor. So this is all pretty standard. And what we find is that collusion is easier with more below bid pricing. And in a moment, I'll tell you how we measure the degree of below bid pricing. And the second finding is that collusion is easier in auctions with more symmetric bidders. So the way we measure the degree of below bid pricing is using this concept called mixed price auctions. And the idea here is that a mixed price auction with a parameter alpha will charge all of these winning bids at a rate of alpha times the bid and 1 minus alpha times the market clearing uniform price. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to span the space of these payment functions. So alpha equals 1 recovers our pay-as-bid auction, and alpha equals 0 recovers uniform pricing. Okay, so with this in mind, our theorem says that for symmetric crank-handle collusion with more than two bidders, we have our critical discount factor being directly proportional to alpha. And H star is the optimal crank-handle height, which does not depend on alpha. So this is highest when alpha is 1, right? So pay-as-bid auctions are the hardest to collude in. And note also that when alpha is 0, we have uniform pricing, and we saw that uniform pricing is sustainable even in a one-shot game. So crank-handle collusion is always sustainable with uniform pricing. We also show that if bidders are asymmetric, then this delta star is increasing in asymmetry. And the reason for that is that when the bidders have different marginal values which are not aligned, it's harder for them to find a crank-handle bid schedule that satisfies the non-deviation incentives for them both. Okay, so if you'd like to talk through the more details on that, I'm happy to do that later, but that's the general intuition. Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes now to look at the empirics, and the empirical evidence comes from auctions for fishing quota in the Faroe Islands. So perhaps the most important question now is, where are the Faroe Islands? So here is the map of Europe, and there they are, north of Scotland, south of Iceland, surrounded by a lot of water. So this immediately tells us that it's a wonderful place for fishing, and the fishing industry is very, very important to the economy of the Faroe Islands. Until 2016, all of the quota was purely grandfathered, so it was just allocated based on historical catch patterns. But in 2016, they experimented with running auctions for 10% of total allowable catch, or the total allowable annual quota. Thereafter, the portion that was auctioned rather than grandfathered was gradually increased depending on species. And to put this in context, these were quite important auctions. So usually when these auctions were run, it would be quota for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and maybe 8 years auctioned together in one cycle of auctions. And in 2017, 1 year quota auctions alone generated almost 1% of national GDP of revenue. So these are really important auctions in this context. There are two commercially lucrative fisheries. One of them is the pelagic fishery for mackerel, herring, blue whiting. And there are 4 incumbents who control 90% of all the quota. And you think like, wow, that's pretty concentrated. How much worse can it get? Well, actually in the Barents Sea demersal fishery, which is fish such as cod, haddock, and rough dab, there are 3 incumbents who control 100% of the quota. So going back to our quote from Ausubel, which said that uniform pricing is nice because absent market power, it is efficient and strategically simple, maybe we have a suspicion that this idea of absence of market power is not satisfied here. But point 4 tells us that, hey, it should be okay because the exercise of market power under uniform pricing should favor smaller bidders. Let's see whether that is what happened. So here are the aggregate bids of 4 incumbents in the 1 year quota in the Barents Sea in 2016. This is the first auction that these fishermen have ever played. They don't have economics degrees and they didn't hire consultants. And this is how they bid. It was a uniform price auction, and the market price of these fish is somewhere between 5 and 6 kroner. So you can see that this high portion of the crank is punitive, as our theory would predict, and the crank drops sharply before where the supply was announced. So without an entrant, this would have been the outcome. There was, however, one entrant who pushed out 2 incumbent bids and became the price setter. So this inflated the market clearing price. However, the entrant, because this vertical part of the crank is so close to supply, they only won a very small proportion, and that wasn't enough to make it a viable operation. So in fact, the entrant did not buy this quota. The next year they tried this again, and if you look at our paper, we have a lot more examples of this, but we can only cover 2 today. Same thing happened, uniform pricing, market would have cleared at reserve. There was another entrant, a different one, who again pushes up the price, but wins such a tiny proportion that again they cannot enter. Okay, so in the last minute or so, let's talk a little bit about what happened next. So eventually the regulators read an early draft of this paper, and in 2019 they decided to try pay-as-bid auctions. So in their auctions for the quota of blue whiting, for the 1-year quota, they used pay-as-bid pricing, but because the industry was upset that pay-as-bid pricing would be used, they retained uniform price auctions for 3- and 8-year quota. And what we would expect, right, is that if they are trying to do crank handle bidding in pay-as-bid auctions, we should expect much flatter bid schedules and potentially a smaller share for the coordinating bidders in case somebody outbids them. So this is what happened. This is the pay-as-bid auction, and these two are uniform price. The coordinated bidders submitted a relatively flat bid schedule.
Daniel,
yeah.
Daniel, time is running out, so if you can.
Yeah. This is literally my second to last slide. So what you can see here that all the non-coordinating bidders would have won the entire market, whereas in uniform pricing, again, it's the incumbents who win almost everything. So just to conclude in 15 seconds, what I hope I have given a flavor to you of is that decoupling prices from bids does not always give more straightforward or honest bidding. Below bid pricing makes collusion and predation easier. In particular, the exercise of market power under below bid pricing frequently doesn't favor smaller bidders, and these gaming opportunities were easily found by bidders with no prior auction experience. Pay-as-bid auctions could have been more robust and may have performed better. So I apologize for running slightly over time. Thank you for listening. I'll take questions in the remaining time that we have, just to make sure that I don't encroach on anyone else's time. Of course, if you have any questions later, please send me an email, or let's coordinate during the conference. So thank you.
Daniel, excellent presentation, and we love your standing up presentation. So Shuei, Humberto, do you have any comments, questions?
Yeah, that's a interesting paper. So you consider the data of Fisher-Quote rates, and do you have any conjecture on why pay-as-bid auction is more prevalent in treasury security markets, where only a select group of primary dealers repeatedly trade with treasuries in the primary market auction? Do you have any conjecture, Daniel?
Yes, so I actually work on treasury bill auctions as well, and I have a paper which looks at Polish data for pay-as-bid versus uniform price, and I find that indeed uniform pricing would not have done better. This was at a time before the Polish ministry switched to uniform pricing, and what happened next we can discuss offline. But I also have a paper looking at discriminatory versus uniform pricing in the Philippines, and it seems that a lot of the time things like coordination are less likely in pay-as-bid auctions, and some regulators and some auctioneers seem to have picked up on this intuitively. Another issue, of course, which you can use in these situations, right, is active supply management, because if you can move the supply, then all of a sudden you will make it unattractive to submit a crank handle, because if the auctioneer sees a crank handle, they can restrict supply, but sometimes for political reasons, supply management isn't feasible. So for example, here, right, if the quota is announced as a national resource, it would be very, very difficult to argue that, oh, look, we should leave this fish in the ocean and not catch it because it has attractive economic properties. Even if this is, true and makes sense for us as market economists, it might be a hard sell to the electorate. But I'm very happy to discuss this at more length, because yeah, treasuries is another topic I work on.
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you.
Great.
Humberto, any comments?
Oh, fantastic presentation, Daniel. Congratulations. So I was guessing how about that construction made with the alpha, right? So alpha, yes. 1 minus up, so kind of a convex combination of two payoff function. So how you come up to that? So you could think of the possibilities of these constructions, right? So a more non-linear combination of these, yes. Payoff combinations. So how this because this is a simple rule, or there is like some features that you think it's a very robust way to design the auction like this?
So we first thought of the two extreme cases, and we wanted to see if continuity is preserved, and we thought that this was a tractable way of doing it. There is in fact a fantastic paper by Kyle Woodward which looks at mixed price auctions, and he uses a similar model which he developed completely independently of us. and he looks also at different values other than linear ones. So I'm happy to send you the reference. It's a great paper, and he seems to think that it's also an interesting family of auctions, and he shows that you can solve for equilibria using also other value families like polynomials of higher orders than just linear. So we started with the linear case, but Kyle's work shows that actually this auction lends itself well to more complicated valuations, which is an independent reason for why it might be a fun model to use.
Yeah. Okay, I have some comments, but I will share bilaterally later. Shuwei, if you can put up your presentation. Thank you so much, Daniel. It was an excellent topic and presentation.
Okay, then thank you. Then let me get started. So the title of the paper is Transparency, Large Informed Dealers, and Treasury Leveling. And the objective of the US Department of the Treasury for marketable securities is to finance the government needs at the least borrowing cost. And for this purpose, the Treasury uses auctions to find a price through competitive bids of dealers in the primary market. And it currently uses uniform price auction for every type of government securities. And those dealers play an important role in the secondary market. They create markets and resell the securities to their individual customers. As one of the debt management strategies, the Treasury immediately discloses some summary statistics about auction results, such as the price. However, little is known about the effects of the transparency policy on the welfare in the Treasury security markets. So that's the question in this paper. And to answer the question, I propose a tractable model to analyze the welfare effect of disclosing the informational content of the primary market price before the secondary market opens. And in this talk, let me focus on the expected revenue result of the Treasury. And I show that the information disclosure affects in two ways. It directly changes the secondary market customers' inference behavior, and it in turn changes the dealer's price impacts, both in the secondary market and in the primary market. And actually, the information disclosure can reduce the dealer's price impact costs, and it enables the Treasury to sell the securities at a lower cost in the primary market and improves the expected revenue. And there are several strands of literatures that are related to my work. And first, in the uniform price auction of divisible asset, where traders submit demand schedules, it is well known that price impacts are first order cost for traders. So my work contributes to this literature by analyzing how the information disclosure can decrease or increase the price impact costs. And actually, there are other papers that also analyze the transparency effect on the endogenous price impact. Boyarchenko, Lucca, and Veldkamp consider pre-trade information sharing among the primary market participants before the auction begins. And they show that with more information sharing among the primary market participants, they become better informed and bid more aggressively. So it improves the expected revenue of the Treasury. So the direct inference effect on the primary market participants is critical to their results. On the other hand, I consider post-auction information disclosure, but before the secondary market opens. And in that case, there is no direct inference effect on the primary market participants, and rather, indirect liquidity effect, price impact effect is critical. Okay. And Rostek and Yoon consider dynamic trading in a centralized market. So the same set of traders, repeatedly trade to share their risk. And in this case, smaller price impact is always beneficial for the traders because it facilitates the risk sharing. In contrast, I consider resale market structure where dealers trade with different counterparties across the primary market and the secondary market. In that case, smaller price impact can be detrimental to the dealer welfare, although I don't have time to go over dealer welfare results in this talk. And there are also papers on the information disclosure for auctions with resale opportunities. And they typically consider single unit demand case. And on the other hand, I consider multi-unit demand case. And as is well known in the literature, multi-unit demand introduces a new type of bid shading. And that is, traders may optimally reduce their demand to strategically decrease the price for the inframarginal unit they purchase. Okay? And actually, it is what the price impact captures. Then let me go on to the model. So there is a divisible risky asset, and there are two types of traders. One is ex-ante symmetric dealers who participate in the primary market and trade with the treasury. On the other is ex-ante symmetric customers who participate in the secondary market and trade with exactly one dealer. Okay? And traders have valuations of the asset that are jointly normally distributed. Each dealer can observe her value realization at the very beginning, which is her private information. On the other hand, customers do not. So that's why the uninformed customers have to infer their unknown valuations before submitting demands in the secondary market. Okay? And that makes the correlations the key primitive to my results, because they control how the private dealers' private informations are informative from the customer's point of view. Okay? And while keeping the symmetric structure, I can allow some extent of degree heterogeneities in correlation. So rho D is the correlation between dealers, and most importantly, rho I1 is the correlation of the customer's valuation with the counterparty dealer's valuation. And the rho I2 is that with other non-counterparty dealers' valuations. Okay? And I assume there is no expected loss from resale. So it ensures the dealers would not purchase the asset from the customers in the secondary market. And the traders are assumed to have quadratic payoff in asset holdings. So the benefit from holding the asset and the quadratic cost of holding the asset. So alpha D and alpha I are exogenous cost parameters for dealers and customers. And traders have quasi-linear preference in terms of money. And here's the timing of the game. At the very beginning, the treasury chooses quantity to be auctioned in the primary market. And it also chooses the informational content of the primary market after the auction, but with a pure noise. Okay? The pure noise is distributed normally with mean zero and some variance. Since the informational content of the primary market price is determined by the equilibrium trades of dealers in the primary market, so what the treasury actually chooses about information policy is just a noise variance. So I analyze what is the optimal noise variance to maximize the expected revenue of the treasury. Then dealers observe their private information. Then trades take place in the primary market based on the uniform price auction. So dealers submit demand schedules given their private information, and the schedules are contingent on the price to be realized in the primary market. And the price is determined to clear the market. Okay. Then after the auction, the public signal is announced. It discloses the realized informational content of the primary market price, but with a pure noise realization. Okay. Then secondary market opens. Each dealer creates secondary market and resell the securities to the customers. Okay, so she submits supply schedules, and her customers, submit demand schedules. Then price is determined to clear that market. And my solution concept is symmetric linear perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium, which is standard in this literature. So it consists of traders' optimal schedules given the beliefs, and the beliefs are updated in a Bayesian way, given the distributions of clearing prices that are characterized by optimal schedules. And let me briefly overview the key observations of the equilibrium. First, equilibrium primary market price aggregates the ex-ante symmetric dealers' private information with equal weights. So it is informationally equivalent to the average dealer's value realization. So this is what the noisy public signal discloses after the auction. In contrast, each secondary market price conveys information about the market-making dealer's opportunity cost of selling, the market-making dealer's private valuation net of inventory cost pre-trade in the secondary market. And it turns out to be informationally equivalent to the convex combination between the market-making dealer's private information and the average dealer private information. The weights are endogenously determined at equilibrium and turns out to be characterized by the primitive number of dealers. And the customers inference about their unknown variation, given information available in the secondary market. So the noisy public signal and the secondary market contingent price. And this conditional expectation can be written as, a fine in terms of the conditioning variables. So inference coefficient on the noisy public signal and the inference coefficient on the secondary market price. And these coefficients are, characterized by primitives given the choice of noise variance by the treasury. Okay. And the equilibrium exists and it is unique. And here's the key channel between the noise variance and the equilibrium. So equilibrium schedules and the prices are characterized as functions of secondary market price impact of dealers. And actually it is increasing in terms of the customer's price inference coefficient. So the public signal noise variance affects equilibrium in two ways. It directly changes the secondary market customer's inference coefficients, and the change in the price inference coefficient in turn changes the dealer's price impact in the secondary market, which is a sufficient statistics about the equilibrium. Okay. So let me state key comparative statistics on the direct inference effect and indirect price impact effect. So this proposition says that degree of heterogeneity in correlation between rho I1 and rho I2 is important. So as long as they are sufficiently homogeneous, their gap is sufficiently small compared to the cutoff correlation level. So this term is positive, which is the first case in this slide. Okay. With homogeneous correlation, the customers put positive weight on the public signal. This is because the dealer's private information is sufficiently equally informative for the customers. So they want to put equal weight on the private information in their inference. Okay? And actually, it is what the primary market price does. Okay? And as the public signal becomes noisier, they rely less on it and more on the secondary market price. Larger price inference coefficient increases the dealer's price impact. On the other hand, with heterogeneous correlations, I get opposite result. Intuitively, this means that the counterparty dealer's private information is more informative for the customers than the no other counterparty dealer's private information. So that's why the customers want to retrieve the counterparty dealer's private information from the secondary market price. To do this, they try to offset the average information by putting negative weight on the public signal. Okay. And as the public signal becomes more noisy, it becomes less useful. So they reduce the weight on the public signal in the absolute value sense, and it in turn decreases the weight on the secondary market price as well. So smaller price inference coefficient decreases the dealer's price impact. Now I am ready to state the welfare result. So the treasury wants to maximize the expected revenue by choosing quantity to be auctioned in the primary market and the public signal noise variance. And expected the primary market—
2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. So expected the primary market price can be seen as the residual inverse supply function the monopoly treasury faces in the primary market. It consists of two terms: expected average of dealers' endogenous valuation, which is a complex combination between dealers' valuation and the resale price. The weight W is endogenously determined at equilibrium. However, the price must be lowered to compensate the dealers' trading cost for absorbing the inelastic supply of the treasury. That's the second term. And it turns out that price is linear in terms of the treasury's supply. So as we see from here, the smaller price impact is beneficial for the treasury because the treasury faces a flatter residual inverse supply function with a higher intercept. So smaller price impact allows the treasury to sell the securities at a lower cost in the primary market. So optimal public signal noise variance should minimize the dealer's price impact in the secondary market, but it depends on the degree of heterogeneity in correlations. With homogeneous correlation, the perfectly precise public signal is optimal. On the other hand, with heterogeneous correlation, perfectly noisy public signal is optimal. So summarizing the talk, so disclosing, I analyzed the welfare effect of information disclosure about the informational content of the primary market price before the secondary market opens. And the indirect liquidity effect is critical to my results. And the disclosure can improve the expected revenue by lowering the dealer's price impact cost. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's all.
Excellent. Thank you very much for keeping very good timing. So Daniel, Humberto, do you have comments, questions, highlights?
So I think it's nice, very nice paper, very interesting. So I was guessing how you connect this to the empirical literature, so if you try to do that. So in which sense these results reflect the results we see, in the real data? Have you tried to do this connection?
Yeah, very good question. I actually, surveying the empirical, works in that literature, including the, treasury securities, corporate bonds, and IPO. And I still don't have good sense, but yeah, that's my future work. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
very good question. Actually, I was thinking of the same. At least to propose some validation. How will you validate in an ideal world? What would be your ideal data set? Something that we usually ask PhD students, what would be your ideal data set for this, if you could imagine? So what would be your ideal setup for testing? It may be not possible to get, but at least you can signal what would be the testing arena. Daniel, any question, comments?
Yeah, I think all three of us, there's a high degree of correlation. We're making the same inference based on the same statistics that we've seen, right? We all have the same idea of how do we take this to data, because I really like the result. I have some data of my own, and I know what is slightly out there. I guess my question might be also, if we were to look at the kind of structures we see, the degree of disclosure that different countries have, or different markets have, to what extent do the characteristics of those markets in some ways fit together with the kind of, you've got two very different predictions, right? And I wonder whether even at some very general level, not necessarily looking even at very micro level data, but at sort of market level averages, to see whether there's any reflection of this at all, because that would be really fascinating to see.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah.
Okay. So yes, so the very good paper, but it needs to maybe suggest what would be the testing arena. If there are no further comments, we are very good in timing. Humberto, would you like to put your slides on?
Yep. Can I? Yeah, sure. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Yep.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is a joint paper with Vitor Faria Luiz and Piero Gottardi. As the title says, this is about the risk classification insurance market with risk and preference heterogeneity. Has nothing to do with auction, but more with insurance market. But there is like some link with the previous paper in the sense of the disclosure of information, as you're gonna see in this presentation. So insurance market risk classification consists of the use by firms of individual data in order to assess or classify individual risk, and as a consequence, to better tailor their premium offers. Intuitively, the use of more information by firms reduces information asymmetry, but on the other hand, introduce price dispersion. If you allow for gender pricing, for instance, many human we have access to different menus of options. That's the idea. For instance, you want to understand the welfare impact of risk classification, and in particular, what the conditions it can be welfare improving in this setting. So in this way, you're gonna model risk classification through signal disclosure in this setting, right? So we propose a parsimonious models to study this question, feature perfect competition. So what I mean with that is the firms act as price takers, and we introduce a two-dimensional heterogeneity model, which you argue is key for the analysis, right? So the classical one-dimensional private information paper that you studied from Micro 101 almost is Rothschild-Stiglitz, and what you get from that is separating outcome and a prior independence outcome as well. So the equilibrium outcome does not depend on the prior distribution of risk types, right? Alternatively, there are many papers in the literature that offers, some implications when you think the world is a little bit more complex in terms of the dimensionality of risk. And just cite two of them. Dubey and Giannakopoulos present like a model where you're gonna get some pooling and equilibrium in this environment of pricing taking. Kerry-Arisheim in a different setting of buy and sellers of assets. They propose a multidimensional, type model, but we argue that multidimensionality heterogeneity is very important in the insurance model. So it allows first for the possibility of cross subsidies and distribution effects that you're gonna see, right? So there is a huge literature on the empirical side showing that this multidimensionality in terms of risk and risk preferences is very important. So just to give like a small list of papers, the first one here, proposed like a structural empirical econometric model to estimate risk preference from data on deductible choice in auto insurance contracts. They show that observability heterogeneity in risk aversion is greater than that on risk, and as I was going to illustrate in this paper, has an important implications for insurance pricing. So our paper is a theoretical paper, it's not empirical, but the empirical part is just, it's tied closely to our contribution, as I will try to, to convince you. So you consider a pricing taking competitive insurance model with risk dispersion and preference heterogeneity. As I said, the equilibrium, we provide the equilibrium characterization in this model, and we show that there might be multiple equilibria, right? In order to deal with this multiplicity of equilibrium, we focus on a small preference heterogeneity case. So using that, you're going to introduce like a methodology based on Taylor approximation for the equilibrium object as functions of this preference heterogeneity. So with that, we give an explicitly dependence of the type distribution in this equilibrium object that I'm going to characterize, which is going to be robust to the equilibrium multiplicity, which is key to the analysis, right? So with that structure, we're going to propose two exercises. One is the signal disclosure. So we're going to show a new monotonicity property for the signal structure based on Kullback-Leibler divergence measure that is going to be necessary and sufficient for a signal disclosure, for a signal structure to be welfare improving, right? And also you show that we using this machinery, this characterization, you're gonna show, we can do like a comparative statistics, policy intended to, for instance, at changing risk distribution in the market. First you show that first order stochastic dominance increasing risk may lower the price instead of increasing price, which is surprising, but the MLRP condition property increases the risk distribution, increases really the price. So it's a matter of how you're gonna use the right concept of comparing risk in the market. It's very important as we illustrate in this paper, right? So the model. Is there any question about the motivation or the idea of the paper so far? If you want, you can ask now. So the model. Insurance contracts is a pair of objects. It's the price you pay for the coverage. The coverage is just a number between 0 and 1 is the amount. You can think about the percentage of coverage. The consumer has a CARA preference with a parameter rho, which represents the risk aversion parameter. The loss distribution is a normal distribution with mean mu, which is the mean loss, and the variance normalized to 1. The private information is about the mu and the rho. Okay. Consumers, given the certain equivalence, derivation, you can represent the consumer preference in a quadratic way. It's going to be mu times x minus the cost of not being covered by 1 minus x, which is quadratic and proportional to risk aversion, minus the price you paid for the coverage. The firm expected profit is the price received by from the consumers minus the expected cost, which is mu times the coverage amount. So for the presentation, we're going to assume independence between risk and risk aversion, but we can generalize as is generalized in the paper for the correlation case. So the risk dispersion is going to be in an interval mu L, mu H, which has a prior distribution phi, which is smooth, density. Risk aversion is a binary distribution, right? So we have two levels of risk aversion, low and high, which is centered, in this rho naught. And we're going to refer to delta as this preference heterogeneity dispersion between the low and high risk aversion. So the preference distribution is omega naught, which is the probability of low risk aversion, right? So what is an equilibrium? This equilibrium is a triple. It's a function that maps the coverage level into a real positive line. And instead of talking about the location, which maps type into coverage, I'm going to do the reverse, which is going to be, important for the analysis in terms of it helps us to characterize the equilibrium. So instead of talking about the direct map, I'm going to talk about the inverse map. I'm going to refer to the type assignment function. For each level of coverage, I'm going to refer to MI as the risk that's associated to, a low risk aversion, and time mu, type mu is the risk associated to this coverage level. So for each coverage, there are two types in terms of risk aversion that's associated to that, potentially to associate to the same coverage level, right? So these are the type assignment function. So an equilibrium is a triple, as I said, which satisfies the price consistent, which is a zero profit condition. The price for the contract is the expected risk time the coverage, and X should be optimal given the for all type mu and rho I. So mu is associated to exactly to this level X. So so the consumer, it can play. You also have restriction on the off equilibrium path that essentially says that the prices of off equilibrium path should be priced by the type that have highest willingness to pay for that coverage, right? I'm not going to the detail because I don't want to have time to do that. So the consumer optimality condition just said that the marginal price should be the marginal willingness to pay for that coverage level. So this gives us the mapping, between the coverage and the types that are going to be associated to that. Playing with that, so taking the expected value, you can use this first order condition and the zero profit condition. Building to these two, we can find the formula for the price, the equilibrium prices. So, but the only thing that the caveat here is the fact that here is the average risk aversion given that contract. But this average risk aversion is an endogenous object because it depends, what is the frequency of low and high risk aversion that is going to be associated to the same coverage level, which is an endogenous object. So in the case of no risk aversion heterogeneity, we have like the one-dimensional characterization, which is given by this formula. When you know the rho, so rho naught, there is a unique equilibrium. This equilibrium does not depend on the distribution, as we know from Rothschild-Stiglitz, right? So in the case of dispersion in risk aversion, so now we have to characterize the equilibrium, and it's more tricky to do that. So you have to really focus on the types that are associated to the same coverage level. There are two potentially types that are going to be associated. One is the low risk aversion, the other is the high risk aversion. These are the first order condition of the consumer. you can see there is a spread between the risk-averse type that is associated to the same coverage, that is determined by the amount of uncoverage and the dispersion between this risk aversion. So this is the nice picture of the paper. If I won't have much time to go through anything, so this is the takeaway of the characterization, right? So as I said, there is an advantage to present the equilibrium in this type assignment way, because we can see this through this picture. So here you see the coverage level between 0 and 1, and here in the vertical line you have like the risk type, which is going to be 1 and 3 in this numerical example here. So for the very high coverage, you're going to see that only high types are associated. So this is a separating part. So these guys are paying per unit of coverage the fair price, which is the risk, right? So this is the part that you have separation. Down here, you also have separation, but given by the low risk averse type. In the middle, you have this discrete pooling region. For each level here in the middle, you're gonna have exactly 2 types. One each is low risk averse, and the other one that is high risk averse that is associated to the same coverage level. And the price per unit is gonna be an average between these 2 types for each level of coverage. And this weighting function is gonna be endogenous determined by the equilibrium characterization, and this is going to be the channel that is going to impact the, the signal disclosure and the comparative statics, as I was saying. The remaining part of the analysis, so this is the proposition that tells you exactly what is in the picture, which is, you can show this more generally. The picture is just a numerical exercise. And what you're going to do, in terms of the analysis, you're going to deal with the limiting behavior. What I mean with that, so I'm going to concentrate in delta equals to 0, which I have a unique separating equilibrium, and I'm going to do the equilibrium characterization, in this neighborhood of the delta equals to 0. So the equilibrium characterization, our equilibrium is going to have this 5-region structure that I just showed in the picture. The equilibrium multiplicity is an issue, as I said, for the counterfactual analysis that I'm proposing in this paper, but you're going to focus on this small preference heterogeneity and leverage the tractability of the case delta equals to 0. So this is going to highlight the novel distribution effects coming from the prior distribution phi, which is the prior distribution of the risk type, right? So what I do is the standard Taylor approximation, but thinking about the delta. So I'm going to, to approximate the price function in terms of this delta parameter, right? So I can take this at 0, which is the one-dimensional equilibrium, the first order term, the second order term, and a term that is, small of delta square, right? This approximation result, we show formally in the paper that the derivative at delta equals to 0 exists, and it is independent of the equilibrium selection. That is very important. So I'm not relying in a specific equilibrium, and allows for robust comparative statics, right? So with that, I can do some algebra. I'm not going through this because it's a little bit more detailed. But the only thing that I want to show is that this is the weighting function. The way I'm weighting the low and the high risk aversion in a given coverage in that discrete pooling region. So this weighting function is going to depend on the prior as a respect, but also depend on the elasticity of the demand for a given coverage level, which is the derivative of the type assignment function. Does not here represent the derivative. So there is this ratio here. So there is a part that is exogenous that depends on the distribution, but also depends on the endogenous part, right? And the derivative of the weight with respect to this parameter is given by this formula. And this is the key thing, right, for the analysis. So first of all, in this independence case, you show that the price, the level price, does not depend on the prior, as you know, but also the first order derivative does not depend in this independence case. Okay, but the second order term is going to depend on the prior distribution you're going to see in this formula. And with that, we can really play with the signal disclosure. So what is a signal disclosure? Given a, a signal is a set S, right? And the signal structure is a pi function that maps for every risk type. I'm going to show to present like a distribution of signals, right? This is exactly the map. So equilibrium payoff are going to be a function of the type mu and rho. Signal disclosure and as observed is given by this US I'm going to omit the dependence on delta. So for the binary case, suppose that we have just two signals, good and bad, right? A binary signal structure satisfies the MLRP if this ratio is going to be increased in terms of risk. So bad risk means a high risk, right? Is strictly monotonic. So a signal structure, what you show in the paper is the signal structure is in theory if welfare improving, if and only if it satisfies MLRP, right? So we generalize that, for the general case in terms of the cardinality of the signal structure using this Kullback-Leibler divergence measure. So the idea is the same. So we introduce like a monotonicity property that generalizes MLRP. And again, I show that the signals that are welfare enhancing are the one that satisfies this monotonicity property. Finally, we can do also comparative statistics because this formula here is building, normally in terms of the comparison of these two terms. Okay. Just to conclude very briefly, what you do in this paper is study welfare effects of risk classification. You present a tractor model with new distribution effect, and the signal disclosure has this interesting idea that novel condition characterizing welfare improving signal characteristics, and the binary case equivalent to the set of moment conditions that I didn't have time to show you in details in this presentation. I'm sorry for overpassing the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Humberto. Long paper, a lot of issues
ideas
to cover,
yeah.
and a short time.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Daniel, Shuhei, any comments, questions that we can cover briefly?
None that I can think of briefly. I'm glad to see the empirical following that there is a set of moment conditions that we could estimate. What I think I'm taking away from this paper is that if I'm going to work on this, it's better for me to outsource some of this to one of you or your co-authors if I'm going to be doing the empirics, so that we could collaborate, because it really does seem like there's a lot happening in this paper. And I would really need a bit more time to understand everything, but I'm glad to see the empirical implications, which is always great.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel.
So do you have any a priori characterization of what would be the risk aversion proportions that you normally expect in the insurance market?
What do you mean with that? So the proportion, you mean
because
the weights
I
of this?
understood that the price will be
an average of this.
By...
Yeah. So what the takeaway for the paper is just to characterize, in the signal disclosure story we just showed you, is to characterize some, implication in terms of what are the signal disclosures. So if you want to disclose some signal, let's say, allow the insurance company to, to condition the contracts on gender or other characteristics, will it be a good idea? So what you do in this paper is show that with a multidimensional wall in terms of the characteristics. So this is you have to, be careful, because there are some signal structures that are not good to allow the insurance company to, to condition on those signals, right? So we really have this characterization in this parsimonious model. It's a specific model, but it's used in the empirical literature. The Cohen paper that I mentioned in the beginning, they use exactly this Cara specification with risk and risk aversion. And in that framework, we are showing some, properties, abstract properties in principle, but that has some implication in terms of conditions that can be tested in the data to see how much, allowing some identification of characteristics of this consumer is a good and a bad idea in terms of welfare enhancing of the market, right? That's the idea. So you're not really, focusing on a structural model to estimate the parameters of in the real world, but you want to, to grasp implication, testable implication that can be used, in order to see how much the, some signals that we interpret this risk classification story you talked about is a good and a bad idea, for the regulator to allow the companies to do.
Yeah. Let me ask if there are any other questions from the audience. If not, I will pass to the last paper today.
Which is yours.
Which is my paper. Okay. Could you confirm that you see the presentation slide? Excellent. So this is the session was called Auctions and Contracts. Actually, probably is the only paper that will be dealing with contracts. So it's a little bit different from the previous ones. And your comments are greatly appreciated. This is part of a larger agenda started with Pablo Spiller that has produced so far 9 papers. And today I'm going to focus on the last one that is dealing with renegotiations, and the paper was accepted last week at the Journal of Law, Economics and Organization. But still, we haven't submitted the last file, so all comments are very welcome. And it's going to be mainly a little bit of theory and mostly empirical. So normally when we talk about public contracts, one thing that stands out is that public contracts are renegotiated very often. And the main literature focus, for example, in Latin American countries with a high degree of renegotiation of public contracts, around 78, 92% within the 2-3 first years of the contract. The literature has identified that the renegotiation of public contracts happens because of aggressive bidding to win the contract, and then once you secure the contract, you can renegotiate. You are you're holding up the public sector, or a trade-off between time to completion and price renegotiations, or more renegotiations the longer the mayor is in office, which probably shows collusion, probable collusion. In any case, bottom line, renegotiations in the public domain are always bad news. What we are trying to show is that actually renegotiation in the public domain is something that happens inherently because it's a response to political risks and is not remediable. So whereas private agents can engage in a relational contract in as much as the relationship is worthy, the public sector cannot and will go into a formal renegotiation, and that is what we observe exposed. And we are going to show you a mechanism that provides the rationale for more renegotiations in the public sector, and also empirical evidence. So let me briefly show the previous models that we developed. If we have a public agent and a private contractor, the voters vote in the public agent and sustain the public agent. And this is the typical two-agent model that we have in public contracting. What happens when we put the third parties into the picture? Who are the third parties? Political opponents, excluded bidders, interest groups that are interested in disrupting this contract, because if I disrupt this contract, I can jump into the public official's role. So third parties are going to try to disturb the relationship between the public official and the contractor. Knowing that in advance, the public official will build procedural rigidities around the contract, make the contract more rigid procedurally, so that the third parties cannot contest the contract, therefore cannot affect the voters and cannot vote out the public agent. What we add in this paper is the renegotiation part. So we model the renegotiation and what we do. And I will not be as fancy with the math as Humberto and Jorge and Daniel. I will just give you the flavor of the model. All the math is in the paper, and the flavor is very simple. We have a contractual space, probabilistic space, contractual features, contractual flexibility, and political tolerance. If the contract is within the contractual flexibility, the contract will continue. If it's outside of the space of contractual flexibility, the contract will be renegotiated because it's technically not viable. The innovation here is also to add a political tolerance. So if the contract is within the political tolerance, the contract will be, the publication will continue, and therefore the contract will continue. And if it's outside of political tolerance, the public agent will be overturned. The public agents, and this is the important part, the public agent's utility function is a function of staying in office, of the probability of continuation, and also the perks of the contract. But if she is not in office, this function will be zero because the perks of being in office and the probability of being in office times the probability of contract continuation also will be zero. So the public agent also always wants, first of all, stay in office, and second, if she stays in office, contract continuation. But if she stays in office, she can renegotiate. Graphically, this can be summarized in the following. Imagine that there is no political influence. So political tolerance is very large. The red circle is very large. All the possible states, 1, 2, 3, realize, are technically safe because they are within the contractual space. Even state 4 is outside of the contractual space, but it's within the flexibility, the technical tolerance. And the only case that the contract will be renegotiated is when it's outside of the flexibility space. What happens when there is more political competition? The political competition makes that the political tolerance is smaller, but within that drags also the contractual features and the contractual flexibility. Therefore, the probability of the contract being renegotiated is much higher when the political competition is tighter. Now we take that into a formalization of hypothesis and to the data. The first one will be that for comparable goods, public to private contracts will be contracted, public to public contracts. So when we have a public agent, will be renegotiated more often than private to private contracts, those which are only in the private sphere. And also that the rate of renegotiation increases in political contestability, in this political competition. Now, to take that to the data is quite hard because we need to compare the same goods over time across contractees, public and private, come up with some measures of contractual feature. How do we measure the contractual features? And also measures of public scrutiny and political contestability. So the data comes from car parks in France. And we have 293 specific contracts with their renegotiation in time. It's one country, one provider, one product, so it's very homogeneous. Across time, we have public municipalities and also private firms contracting with other private firms for car parks, for example, an airport or a hospital. The measure of contractual features is actually done through textual analysis. So we scrap the contracts and we came up with dictionaries that later on normalize into a Z-score of how rigid the contract is, how many of these particular clauses are in each contract. Then we have, of course, public to private comparison. And for political competition, we use, which is standard in the political science literature, the number of equal parties, which is the inverse of the Herfindahl index of the share of the parties. Okay, the data is quite homogeneously, nicely distributed across France. More contracts in the Paris area, but that is normal. But so we have all over France, and at first glance, public contracts are renegotiated more often than private contracts. When we check more robustly with the data, so here is the results of our regressions. For the first hypothesis was that public contracts are renegotiated more often than public contracts. And we find that public contracts, indeed, are renegotiated between 8%, 11% more often than private contracts, 13% in some specification. Look that corruption is not statistically significant. It doesn't have an effect on renegotiation rates. So the renegotiation rates of public contracts is mostly driven in comparison to private by being in the public sector. Again, the product is very homogeneous. It's car parks. It's this almost the same, and we control for the type of contract, the contract duration, how big these car parks are. For the second hypothesis, which was that public renegotiations rises in political contestability, we use an IV strategy, an instrumental variable. And we instrument, first of all, the publicness, rigidity, our measures of rigidity that we show in a previous study that they were correlated with publicness. So first, we show that public contracts are more rigid, and that is that rigidity that drives renegotiation rates. Also, when there is more equal parties, so when the political spectrum is more contested, that renegotiation rates rises. And also when the number of residual equal parties. So here what we take is, we take out of the Herfindahl index the biggest party, and we look at what is the spectrum of the remaining parties. And also when the scene is more, let's say, diverse, more parties in the political scene, that also drives more renegotiations. To conclude, so first of all, we show a theoretical framework from the understanding of public contract renegotiation, and we provide some novel hypotheses. We show that renegotiation rates in the public sphere are around 7 to 13% more frequently renegotiated in comparison to private contracts. We point out, and this is probably the two main results, that previous studies showing that public contracts are inefficient, and that inefficiency drives renegotiation probably is flawed, because frequent renegotiations actually may be a consequence of their non-remediable rigidity, that public contracts are born very rigid, and that is what drives the renegotiation. So thank you very much. I'm 2 minutes ahead of time. Please feel free to challenge and make questions.
Very nice, Marian. So I was thinking alternative histories that can lead to the same conclusion, right? Mm-hmm. So I was, I didn't have much time to think more, the detail, but there is like this idea of cost overrun, right? So the public contracts are, more sensitive to the fact that you hide like this contract, and then, they kind of underbidding because they know they are gonna really renegotiate that later on, right? So I was kind of trying to come up with other possibilities that explain the same results you have here. How much, in a way, how much I can buy your, the strategy you showed, compared to other possibilities that literature has raised before, right?
Yes. So that is the classic example, the first usual suspect. Why public contracts are renegotiated more often? Well, because aggressive bidding. You bid low to win the contract, and then you.
That's a little bit what I was thinking. Yes. Okay.
Absolutely. So this is the typical example shown in the literature. But bear in mind here that we have a product that is standardized, that is a repeated game, and is the largest car part provider in France. So this guy cannot use that strategy repeatedly because it would be too obvious. That may be true if you build one bridge or you do something that is unique, okay? But even in that case, which we don't have, so in our setup, this is not a problem in the empirical part. Now, I would argue also from my short experience in government that the reason contracts are renegotiated is not necessarily the aggressive bidding, but that the public agents, the politicians, try to cover their butts with very strict, rigid contracts, not to be sued when they are out of office of misuse of public monies. And in Brazil, if memory serves, you recently had a very large scandal with Odebrecht, right? That politicians were flexibly contracting. So what would do a politician post Odebrecht? He will be very careful in crafting the contract, putting even more clauses that are necessary. But that makes that when the state of the world is outside of the expected state of the world, you will have to renegotiate. So the Odebrecht in this picture would be the red circle becomes even shrinker because there is more political scrutiny, and that makes that exposed the contract will be renegotiated more often. But unfortunately, this is not remediable. So public contracts, what we at the end will say, well, it is what it is. Public contracts are renegotiated formally more often. In the private domain, you may agree on the phone. In the public domain, you will have to write it down, and that is the formal renegotiations.
Another, if you allowed me, another clarifying question is, you present the model very briefly, but these sets you're presenting here in the picture, they are fixed, right? So they are exogenous. So you're doing a kind of comparative statics in terms of the possibilities, right?
The states of the world, yes.
The state of the world, yes, but also the sets, right? The X, the calligraph XP, these sets you're showing the picture now.
The contract, yes. So this is the contract that you come in and negotiate.
Yeah, but so this set is given, right, in the model, right? So this set is not endogenous.
No. The set is negotiated by both parties. So
so this is an endogenous. This is an endogenous
thing. So the public agent is going to set the contract terms in such a way that maximizes this utility function.
Okay.
Staying in office and conditional on staying in office to have the larger probability of contract continuation. So for the public agent is, if I go too far here, I will be politically challenged. If I go too close, the contract will be technically not feasible. So there is a trade-off, and endogenously you come up with the contractual terms.
Okay.
Any other comments or critics? If not, thank you very much for the session. Any other comments that you want to make to each other before we close the session?
I'm looking forward to see your paper more closely, because I thought the three of you guys are great papers. I have to look at more carefully. It's a 15 minutes presentation. It's very hard
to
convey
very
everything.
Close, and the Zoom presentations are fine because we're all over the world, but we don't have the coffees to go on the corridor.
This is the trade-off. So, that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's a shame.
I sent an email to all of you, so you have the emails of the rest. So feel free to continue the conversation.
That's a good idea.
here.
Yeah, sure.
Again,
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne, for
We
conducting
went a
this
little bit
session.
ahead of time to give you time to move to the next session.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank
Good
you.
night,
you all.
Daniel.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.